today's session will deal with the country of Iran. And over the last 12 months or so, particularly the last few weeks in fact, there have been a number of significant developments in relation to this country. And what is significant, of course, is that Iran appears specifically in Ezekiel 38. It's the Persia of Ezekiel 38, verse 5. And the Hebrew word paraz, which is specifically used of Persia proper and also used of the Persian Empire, is specifically used by Ezekiel in chapter 27 and verse 10 of the area we now know as Iran. So what a remarkable thing that 2,500 years after prophecy was given, Iran would still be on the map. And Iran, in fact, forms part of the coalition of countries which will be with Russia at the time of the end. Let's just refresh our memories a little bit about what the prophetic expectations are in the Word of God. We know from Ezekiel chapter 38 and verse 13 that Sheba and Dedan will be in close alliance in the prophecy. They're the ones that say to go, "Art thou come to take a spoil?" And therefore our interest in Iran also has an interest in this region, the Saudi Peninsula. Dedan is the area we now know as Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, United Arab Emirates. And Sheba is the area we know now as Yemen. And we'll talk a little bit more about this whole configuration of the Middle East as our remarks progress this afternoon. What is significant about latter-day prophecy is, not only is Ezekiel 38 important, of course, but Daniel chapter 11. And Daniel 11 talks about the king of the north coming against him, which is the Turkish power, and finally invading the nation of Israel. Now, the king of the north, brothers and sisters and young people, was a designation of what we now style the ancient Seleucid Empire. It was the empire that went across Syria and Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. And it's quite clear from Daniel chapter 11 that when Russia takes control of this whole area, this Eurasian area, then it is now time for the invasion to take place. And the invasion is swift, like a cloud to cover the land, with many ships. So therefore we expect, in this region of the Middle East, an alliance of countries which is going to form part of this ancient Seleucid Empire, this King of the North area. And therefore we are very interested in what happens in Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. Very interested indeed. And Iran is going to, as we shall see this afternoon, is going to form a vital part of this remarkable alliance. In Joel chapter 3, we have a latter-day prophecy, as Brother Frank has indicated this afternoon, of the invasion of the Holy Land by all nations. And what Joel talks about is a number of small factions that dare to try and give a recompense to God for what they've done. And God turns around to these people, Tyre, Zidon, and Palestine, in fact the Hebrew is the coast of Philistia, and says to them, how dare you offer a recompense to me? How dare you try and make up for what you've done? And Joel chapter 3 describes what they've done. They sold the Jews off into southern Europe, the Grecians. They robbed the synagogues and brought them back to their mosques, their holy temples, says Joel 3. And they dare to try and offer God a recompense of what they've done. And God says, I will swiftly and speedily give you a recompense upon your own head. Now, the significance of this quotation is this, that in the latter days there will be a section of Israel and of the Middle East which will be anti-Semitic and will assist the Russian invasion. Tyre and Zidon, we would call today Lebanon, we would call today Hezbollah. And the coast of Philistia is the area of Hamas. Isn't that interesting? There's a very modern prophecy 2,500 years ago that specifically identifies people who are going to assist the Russian invasion. The area of Hamas, the area of Hezbollah. We also have another remarkable Middle East configuration. Daniel 11 talks about Edom, Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. We would know this today to be modern Jordan. Now, modern Jordan is a country that has no natural resources. It has no wealth. It's dependent on Saudi and foreign aid to keep the country alive. And yet, Russia is unable to take this country when it invades. As Daniel 11 verse 41 says, they will escape his hand. So there's something about Jordan in all its configuration, in the Middle East complexity, that's going to, I guess, almost rebuke Russia. That Russia can't take that area. There's something in that country that's going to manifest itself and will not form part of the invasion. And lastly, we come in our consideration this afternoon to Egypt. The land of Egypt shall also not escape this invasion. Now, what is interesting about that expression is this. It's not called the king of the south. You see, in Daniel chapter 11, you have this tug of war, this struggle between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, those in Syria, those in Egypt. The king of the south is a designation of a foreign power in occupation of Egypt. But at the time of the end, it's the land of Egypt, not the king of the south. And that means, brothers, sisters and young people, that Egypt will retain its independence right to the very end. It'll be taken by Russia, but it will be done as an independent country. It's no longer a foreign power in occupation of Egypt. And we have seen dramatic events happening in Egypt, which is not really our subject this afternoon, but events which are going to fit into that jigsaw puzzle where it will retain its independence. The land of Egypt shall not escape. Those are prophetic expectations that, in very brief summary, we expect to happen across the Middle East. A dominant area, eventually taken by Russia. So we ask the question, how might God bring Sheba and Dedan into a position of helping the Jewish state? I mean, they're the ones that say in Ezekiel 38, art thou come to take a spoil? They would hardly say that if they were part of the invasion. They would hardly say that if they had no interest in the Middle East area of Israel. So what's going to bring Sheba and Dedan together to support Israel? And how might God bring Sheba and Dedan together in a closer alliance? At the moment, the area of Dedan, which is the area of Yemen there on the map, is not part of the Sheba Confederacy. The picture of those Arabs there is a picture of the current rulers of the Gulf Economic grouping of nations. And those nations, the Dedan of Scripture, will one day merge with Yemen and become part of the Sheba and Dedan of the Scriptures. How's God going to bring those countries together? How might God ensure that the Gaza Strip and the area of Lebanon, Hezbollah, will remain anti-Semitic right up until Armageddon? Those two leaders there, Nasrallah and Mashal, fiercely anti-Semitic. What's going to keep them anti-Semitic all the way through so they assist that invasion? And how might God bring Iran into prominence in the region? This is a country which has been through turmoil. And we're going to see a little bit of the economy and history of Iran and to see the remarkable changes that God has made to bring this nation back into prominence. It's a fascinating picture. What wonderful smiling faces we have there of the Ayatollah. But he's anti-Semitic to the core. How is God going to arrange all of these things? Well, when you look at the remarkable things that are happening, you also have to ask yourself the question, how is Russia going to become the king of the north? We have seen in our first talk Russia's building strength. The alliance with Russia and Europe will be a fait accompli, and so also will Russia's advances into the area of the Middle East. Not all the Middle East, just the king of the north territory, that area of Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan and Pakistan. How is that going to happen? Well, in surveying all of these things, brothers and sisters, there really have been two key developments. And one of those developments, of course, is Iran. That in fact, is a photograph of one of the great towers built in the region of Tehran. You need to get into your mind, brothers and sisters and young people, that Iran today is not a backward Middle East country. It's a very sophisticated, technology-driven country. Its architecture is quite splendid. But there have been two key developments in the Middle East which is going to bring this great crisis to a conclusion. The first was in 1979, when the Islamic Revolution took place in Iran. A huge convulsion, massive change to this particular people. Before Iran endured a revolution, it's interesting to note that Russia's advances against Persia at the time were well known. Brother Frank mentioned the Crimean War. Well, you may be also interested to know that Russia also had designs on Persia. And it's interesting that in the 1800s, the 1820s, there was an attempt by Russia to invade Persia. And you'll see from that map there that it took areas back, part of Armenia, part of Dagestan, part of Georgia, as it nibbled away at the territory of Persia. It's always had a design on that region, even before oil was discovered in that area. Here's a map of what the Middle East looked like in World War I, just at the outbreak. And I want you to notice that circle there on that particular map. And you'll find there that Persia itself there really had three areas of influence. The top one was Russia in red. The middle one was the Persian people in yellow, and the bottom one is the British in green. So you see, even at the outbreak of World War I, Persia itself is a country that is desirable by world powers. The Ottoman Empire was breaking up. The Persian Empire had collapsed through huge changes, and Iran was divided between Russian and British interests. Shortly after World War I, in 1921, a Colonel Reza Khan overthrew the Persian government and became known as the first Shah of Persia. He then changed the name Persia to Iran, and he, through great modernization, changed the whole structure of Persia to Iran, a massive reorganization of government. He was wary of Western interests. Oil had recently been discovered. It was a prized possession of wealth, and this man, this first Shah, was very much suspicious of the West. So he cultivated a connection with Germany. In fact, Germany, after a while, began to gain a monopoly of Iranian business. In so doing, the Shah modernized Iran to become a force in the Middle East. 126,000 troops poised to enter into the conflicts of World War II. And you know, in 1941, Russia and Britain invaded Persia, invaded Iran. Don't know whether you knew that. Gog and Tarshish invaded Iran. See, during World War II, because Iran was supporting Germany, Germany was using Iran as the means for supporting its troops through oil. It needed the supply of oil for its weapons. And therefore, because Russia was on Germany's side, this corridor of Iran was used to bring oil up through Iran, into Russia, over into Germany. Well, Russia changed size. The Soviet Union changed size. At that time, in 1941, it was now time for Britain and for Russia together to seize this country, Iran, because this was a vital supply line of oil for the German war machine. Using Indian troops, that's interesting, and British troops. In blue there, they came across from Iraq, took the oil wells, and Russia came in from the north. And that corridor was so significant during World War II that 5 million tons of munitions were moved through that corridor into Russia. You couldn't get through Europe. World War II in Europe, a disaster area, Germany having a stranglehold. So Iran became the corridor of weapons, of oil into Russia. And therefore Britain and Russia needed to seize that whole arrangement. The occupation of Iran, in fact, proved to be a vital importance to the Allied cause during World War II. And it brought Iran, of course, closer to the West. Oil was the key. Well, this man I'm sure we are familiar with, the second Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He was so pro-West, in fact, that everything was cultivated to be Western. At some time during Iran's history, the Persian government tried to nationalise oil, and that received a swift response from Britain. Britain was very keen to ensure that the oil supply in the Middle East came from this particular region. And the ties between Washington and London and Iran through this man were significant. He's called the Emperor of Oil in the Time magazine there. The Emperor of Oil. He modernised the country. But all was not well under the surface. This man had a brutal secret service called Savak. And this brutal secret service infiltrated itself across the Iranian population, a little bit like the Gestapo of World War II. The secret police of East Germany, detailing everyone's correspondence, detailing everyone's life, until finally it became intolerable and the masses in Iran had had enough. And that brought a revolution that changed Iran, we could say, forever. Now, what is significant about this revolution is that this man, the Ayatollah Khomeini, was in France agitating for change. His headquarters were in Paris, which is the frog country of Revelation 16. And the ideas of liberty, equality, fraternity, and revolution had its seeds in this man in Paris. Isn't that interesting? The frog spirit, madness across the world, has again its roots here in France and Paris. And this man in isolation began to foment disturbance, unrest. And in 1979, this revolution burst across the landscape of Iran. And it was a massive change. America was the great Satan. You may recall the news of the time, the US embassy, 444 days I think it was, in which the Americans were caged up in the US embassy in Iran. The debacle of the Americans trying to rescue these people crossed the pages of the world. And this man now projected America as the great Satan. The great Satan. Now, the effects of that revolution were so dramatic that it had ripples across the Middle East, and they still are reverberating today. One of the huge convulsions was this vast diaspora of Iranians. And I'd like you to keep that in mind, because we'll come to this in our final comments of the talk this afternoon. According to various sources, in 2013, there were an estimated 5 million Iranians living outside Iran. Now, this is interesting. They're called the Iranian diaspora. You may have, in fact, come across Iranians. They say they are Persians. They're Iranians. And like the Jews themselves in their diaspora, they keep themselves very much together. They are an identifiable group of people. 5 million in 2013. Their net worth is $2 trillion, and for the most part, they emigrated, escaping the revolution in 1979. They could not stand this repression, this clerical repression in Iran. 5 million, a huge convulsion of the country, people escaping, the intellectuals, the great brain drain of this country. And another outcome of the revolution was this anti-Semitism that began to arise in the country, unashamed anti-Semitism. In fact, the US accuses Iran of exporting terrorism. The two countries nearly came out to outright war in 1988. This man, no longer in power, but a symbol, if you like, of the huge feeling of anti-Semitism in Iran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Iran's President Ahmadinejad really wants Israel wiped off the map and plans to get the bomb. That was a magazine, Australian Review, Jewish Review. He held a special conference. It was called The World Without Zionism. Imagine having that, a public lecture. The World Without Zionism. This is what he said. 2006. Thanks to people's wishes and God's will, the trend for the existence of the Zionist regime is downwards, and this is what God has promised and what all nations want. Just as the Soviet Union was wiped out and today does not exist, so will the Zionist regime soon be wiped out. Now we know prophetically, of course, that will never happen. People of Israel are God's people. He's put them there, secured them there. And though they will suffer the indignity and awfulness of Armageddon, they will not be wiped off the map. But that's the spirit of the clerics, of the powers that be in Iran today. Well, America reacted to that, of course, and they realised that this man wants to get a nuclear weapon. We need to put pressure on Iran. We need to make sure that international sanctions take place. And those sanctions have hurt Iran very, very deeply, exceedingly deeply. The other key development, and we'll come back to Iran a little later, the other key development is what's known as the Arab Spring. This took place 2010, 2011. The Arab Spring was, in the eyes of the Arab world, a hopeful solution to removing all of these tin pot dictators and replacing them with the will of the people. There was great hope that at last we could get some type of dependence and liberty and equality through the Middle East. The Arab Spring soon turned to an Arab winter. I'm sure we're quite familiar with this kind of map in the Middle East, the Sunni Shia divide. And you'll see there on the map that the areas in red are the Shias and those in yellow are the Sunnis. Yellow, Sunni, I thought it was quite appropriate. But they are fanatics. You'll notice there that Iran is predominantly Shiite. Saudi Arabia, predominantly Sunni. And this tug of war has been going for hundreds of years as these two parts of the Arab world fight over who is the true successor to Muhammad. What's interesting is that on that little map there, you'll notice that there is a section there in Iraq that's half Sunni and half Shiite. You'll notice on the western coast of Syria, the current president, Bashar al-Assad, belongs to a faction of the Shiite group. You'll notice also in that map that there is a predominance of oil wells in both divisions of the Arab world. Now that's what keeps the thing on the boil. They have the wealth, they have the power, they have the influence to support each of their own particular branch of Islam. Huge amount of oil wells in Iraq and Iran, and huge amount of oil wells in the region of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. And across that divide is this massive dislocation. What is also interesting is that when World War I finished, there was a secret deal made between France and by Britain in carving up the Middle East. It's called the Picot-Sykes Agreement, secretly done in the boardrooms and back rooms of power at the end of World War I. Russia was to be part of that, but unfortunately, the revolution took them out of the picture, so it's just between France and Britain. And not really understanding all of this division of Sunni and Shiite, not really understanding all the ethnic difficulties in the Middle East, they just simply drew a line across the map and said, France, you get the northern part, Britain, you get the southern part. Britain got the deal because it got the oil. And that division of the Middle East, carved up in the boardrooms and back rooms of politicking in World War I, has set the scene for the disasters of the Middle East that we see today. Doesn't matter whether you were Sunni or Shiite or a Kurd, you were just simply a line on the map. And that's created intense and enormous problems. Now, the Arab Spring also has a frog spirit origin. These are the countries that were involved in that Arab Spring. They began in the North African countries that were ex-French colonies. So the influence of France across the North African continent was such that eventually it became, that spirit of Frenchness became a spirit of revolution. And beginning in Tunisia, there in the middle of that map, the government was overthrown. And you can see there through the various colours through there, where governments are overthrown, where there are serious changes of government. Even Saudi Arabia was affected by this, as it had to put down some of rebellions in this particular country. And all of this is fermenting across the Middle East with dramatic changes, with the revolution, the frog spirit revolution in Iran, and now the frog spirit revolution through the North African and Middle East countries. The whole place is in turmoil, and God is using all of this to manipulate the nations towards his purpose. It's an amazing thing. Where's the French frog spirit in this? I have an agenda, says this man. Equality equals justice. Democracy is a new constitution. Dignity and freedom. That's the words of the French Revolution. The frog spirit everywhere. Libya, Bahrain, Yemen, Iran, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, with liberté through the words. The Arab Spring was the hope of the Arab people to take control of their countries. But the reason why it's significant from a biblical perspective is that it came to a shuddering halt in Syria. It stalled in Syria. In 2011, there were a number of pro-democracy protests in the northern part of Syria, a place called Daraa. And there a number of students sprayed in graffiti some anti-government slogans across a high school. And the response of the Syrian troops was to shoot those students. Well, that made the whole place turn into an eruption demonstration. And that small fire that was ignited in that simple graffiti incident turned the whole country into the region of civil war. And President Bashar al-Assad was on the defensive. Civil war soon broke out, and the Arab Spring came to a shuddering halt. Now, this all has an impact on our Middle East scenario as far as prophecy is concerned. There are massive convulsions happening in this region. You just look at this statistic. Syrian refugees surpass 4 million. 1.8 million Syrians are in refugee camps on the Turkish border. That's like taking the population of Adelaide and doubling it and having them camping out in the hills there. 1.8 million people out there. Just over 1 million people in Lebanon. You can imagine the pressure points this is happening in the Middle East. 629,000 in Jordan, which is creating enormous problems in Jordan. Huge humanitarian issues. A further 7.6 million Syrians have been internally displaced within the country. So the total number of people displaced by this war is 11 million, half the pre-crisis population. 11 million people displaced. Enormous pressure on these countries. In fact, it's been called the greatest refugee exodus in recent history. How do you like to be living in tents? Cold and heat. While all the men at war, dying, killing. The war ebbing and flowing. It is a massive conflict. And that brings with it, of course, the rise of extremism. It brings with it other nations pouring money in. It makes alliances. So we find it, for example, Saudi Arabia is now going to react to this particular crisis. You see, Bashar al-Assad is Shiite. Saudi Arabia is Sunni. So there's an immediate conflict here. And Saudi Arabia is intent on removing the Syrian president. So it bankrolls Egypt, change of government there. It bankrolls the former Lebanese governor, sends troops to Bahrain to quell any disturbances through there, and it cracks down on its own Shiite minorities. There's a reaction, you see. This is what revolutions do. They have reactions. So Saudi Arabia pumps money and weapons and arms and influence, considerable influence, into this region. Iran, on the other hand, is also going to react. Remember I said before that Iraq is divided into half Shiite, half Sunni? Well, Iran wants to prop up that Shiite part of Iraq. So it supports Bashar al-Assad and it supports the Shiite minority in Iraq. So there's a huge complexity now occurring in this whole situation where these, I guess, powerful nations with plenty of money, oil dollars, are now going to influence the outcome of the Middle East. Now, let's try and make sense of this Syrian conflict. Took me a while to get my head around it. It's like having a tray of jelly, and every time you move the bowl, the jelly changes. It's a changing alliances everywhere. But it is significant what's now come out. Those colours indicate the diversity of conflict in that country. It is a mess, an absolute mess. The green there are the Syrian armed forces, the bluish colour are the opposition forces, the orange colour is ISIS, and the red colour are the Kurds. Let's just have a look at these. The Syrian armed forces, about 200,000 strong, these support Bashar al-Assad. These want to keep the Syrian government in power. They have co-opted Hezbollah into joining with them to resist these opposition forces. And Hezbollah has been very successful in assisting Bashar al-Assad. What it's done is actually, it's removed the pressure point from Israel a little bit. You see, Hezbollah has this amazing rocket arsenal over the border in Israel. And by moving into the Syrian conflict, it's taken pressure off the Israeli-Lebanese border. On the other side of the fence, you have those fighting against Assad. The Al-Nusra Front, the Islamic Front itself. These are quite effective in bringing together disparate groups of rebels, and they're keen on ousting Assad. Another group, the Khorasan group. And lastly, the Free Syrian Army, all loose connections of rebels. There are also, up there in the north, the Kurds. These are people who seek their own independence. They seek their own part of the Middle East. They're an effective fighting group, Peshmerga they're called, and they also fight alongside the PPK, which is an outlawed organisation as far as the United States is concerned. So there's a huge mixture of everybody, of every persuasion, in this conflict. Some of these people are fierce fighters, and the wars continue. But what is significant is this, is that these forces are what are called proxy wars. On the green side there, with the Syrian armed forces and also Hezbollah, funding that and supporting that are two powerful entities, Russia and Iran. So whilst Russian troops are not in the region, they are using those proxy countries, those proxy people, to fight their battles. And on the other side, Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar. They're pumping money and arms in. So you see, it's what's called a proxy war. There are reports of 10,000 Iranian operatives within Syria. Now think about that. 10,000 Iranian operatives in Syria. In fact, recently when Israel accidentally, and I use the word accidentally in inverted commas, hit an area just past the Golan Heights, when they went through the dead, they found Iranian soldiers and an Iranian colonel. That's how close Iran was pushing the boundaries of its influence in the Middle East. Persia of Ezekiel 38 is now becoming dominant in the region, and it's flexing its muscles through these particular proxy nations. The Revolutionary Guard, the Quds Force, the intelligence services of Iran are deeply embedded in this conflict. They are closer to Israel than Israel thought possible. And of course, working through Hezbollah, it's also close to Israel. On the other hand, the Saudis, pumping money across into the rebel group, seeks to change the effects of the war. What is also made also is the emergence of extremism, ISIS. It's the group there in orange. And they're the people who want to establish a caliphate in the Middle East. And they want to go back to Islamic times where the caliph ran the Fertile Crescent and the successor to Muhammad was well known, and they've declared this caliphate. Everybody hates ISIS, but we'll come back to ISIS in a moment. This group stemmed out of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. They are so brutal that they have been disowned by Al-Qaeda. Now, that picture there on the right was a Jordanian Air Force officer who was captured by ISIS, placed in a cage, and publicly, across the internet, for the world to see, was incinerated alive. These are the people who take people to beaches and cut off their head. They did that in Libya. These are the people who have no problem at all executing friend and foe alike. They are brutal to the extreme. They are an effective fighting force. They targeted the oil wells of Iraq. The New York Times reported that last year, ISIS brought in $100 million from tax revenues on oil alone. That's how they fund their operations. So that map where we saw the orange sprinkled through Syria was significant because it followed the oil wells. Everyone's after the oil. Follow the dollar. Now, the effect of all of this and the emergence of ISIS has had some interesting repercussions. ISIS threat brings Jordan and Egypt closer to Israel. Saudi Arabia, Jordan and Egypt unify to battle ISIS. Is Iran next? Isn't that interesting? That we expect from Ezekiel chapter 38, Sheba Dedan is going to be on the side of Israel. And look at this. This is brought together, a common enemy. ISIS is just trying to penetrate the Jordanian border. So Israel gives Jordan 16 Cobra attack helicopters. Common enemy, Israel-Jordan relationships reportedly improving as both sides struggle to battle radical Islamism, security sources say. The fight against ISIS has tightened the Israel-Jordan relations. It's also changed Israel's perception of the danger of ISIS. Next, Mideast flashpoint. ISIS threatens the Druze. Now, the Druze are a small community who live in the Golan Heights. Been there for hundreds of years. And what's happened is that ISIS is now pushing against this Druze community. And they were under the protection of Bashar al-Assad, and he's now withdrawn his forces. So the Druze are suddenly saying, we need help, we need help. And they're turning to Israel for help. Now, Israel does not want to get drawn into a conflict with ISIS. You see, each penetration, each probe brings it closer and closer to the anti-Semitism and the evil of this whole force. And the US policy in Syria. Well, I think everyone is disappointed with Barack Obama. His whole policy in the Middle East is confused. As we have there on the screen, it's now softened its position on the future of Assad, He was keen to get rid of the man, particularly when he inflicted chemical warfare on his own people. And now the stance has softened, because ISIS to the Americans are the enemy. And so it launches airstrikes. Just recently, Turkey has been involved in those airstrikes as well. So what that has done, as we have there on the third point on that slide, is that by launching airstrikes against ISIS in Syria, the US actually is subconsciously helping the regime of Syria. It wants to find someone in Syria that they can give weapons to. It doesn't trust anybody, even the rebels who are fighting against Syria. With all of their extremeness, they're caught in this situation. And so it's a vacuum as they're moving out. Now those bombing raids, small thing, perhaps, but there are the strikes against ISIS across the areas of the oil wells, the oil fields, to try and disrupt the weapons supply and the money supply in that region. And have a look at the nations that are involved in the bombing. It's Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish. It's Jordan. It's Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, and America and Britain. You know, isn't it interesting that just a simple thing about agreeing to run some bombing strikes against ISIS, the nations that should coalesce together are the very nations which will ally themselves together in Ezekiel 38. So the ISIS-Iranian war has now produced this bond between these countries. It's an amazing thing, astounding thing to see that. Well, this is the subject that has caught the world's attention. The Iranian nuclear deal. And I guess after a while you get sick of hearing about the Iranian nuclear deal, but it is a significant event in Middle East politics. And Iran, the Persia of Ezekiel 38, is right in the middle of this, obviously, in this whole situation. Well, the deal was that Iran would halt its enrichment, reduce the number of centrifuges that would produce it, cut its stockpile of low and medium enriched uranium, and ensure that it would not produce nuclear weapons. And for that, the Western powers, the P5+1, that's the Security Council plus Germany, agreed to lift sanctions from Iran. They'll put them back if Iran doesn't come to the table, or if Iran doesn't allow inspectors to come. The problem is with this, is that the West doesn't really know the extent of the Iranian nuclear capability. It doesn't know what's underground, precisely. It doesn't know what reactors are being hidden away, and therefore may never ever be inspected by weapons inspectors. But Barack Obama has pushed it through as the deal of the decade. Well, the reaction has been quite swift from Israel. A stunning, historic mistake, said Netanyahu. One of the darkest days in world history. It was a good deal for Iran, but not for Israel. But the reaction was not only this from Israel. The Republicans, Huckabee says Iran nuclear deal marching the Israelis to the door of the oven. Now that's inflammatory language. A reference to the gas chambers of Hitler's regime. Inflammatory language. Israel distanced itself actually from that statement, but the Republicans were quite firm that this deal with Iran was enough to sink the state of Israel. Marching the Israelis to the door of the oven. But that deal, says the Business Insider, is turning Israel and Saudi Arabia into allies. Excuse me. Israel and Saudi Arabia don't have official relations, says the article, and Riyadh still does not recognise Israel's right to exist. But the two states have held 5 secret meetings since the start of 2014 in order to discuss the rise of Iran, Eli Lake reports for Bloomberg View. The meetings have led to a level of unprecedented strategic understanding between the two countries. We've discovered the same problems and the same challenges and some of the same answers. So think about this. A country that has no diplomatic relation with Israel, we publicly have nothing to do with you Jews, but we're holding secret talks because we have a common enemy. And God is bringing these nations together because of this Iranian ascendancy in the Middle East, a common enemy. An amazing thing. Israel and Saudi Arabia present united front over Iran deal. Saudi Arabia's King Salman backs Israel over Iran nuclear deal concerns. And whilst Saudi Arabia says, well, I suppose we're okay, privately they're saying, we don't like this deal. We agree with Israel. We have the same reservations that Israel has. Dedan and Israel being locked into common assent. Two long-standing Middle Eastern opponents now becoming friends. How God changes the world. An astounding situation. Reluctantly agreeing, Saudi Arabia is still with Israel on this. And though it cautiously welcomes that deal, it knows that Iran is still the threat. Now, this is the big winner for Iran. Because once those sanctions are lifted, billions of dollars are going to roll into this country. All those frozen assets, all that inability to trade across the world is now going to be suddenly released. The brakes are off and money is going to pour into that country. Iran, after sanctions, an emerging economic giant. An Iranian nuclear agreement could be an economic game changer, and it will be. I don't know whether you're aware, but Iran has the world's 18th largest economy, and this is under sanctions. The population of 18 million is well educated. As I mentioned before, it's not some backward Arab backwater. The Tehran Stock Exchange, the second largest in the Middle East. In the next 5 years, this country needs $230 to $260 billion of investment to get the oil flowing again, and that money will come in. Despite enduring decades of sanctions, Iran has managed to establish the Middle East's most expansive industrial base. It stands amongst the top 15 steel-producing countries, the top 5 cement producers in the world, the top 15 automobile manufacturers in the world. We can't even manufacture cars here in Australia. Iran has ventured into cutting science, cutting-edge sciences, nanotechnology, stem cell research. Just recently, the first woman in history to receive the Nobel Peace Prize for Mathematics was an Iranian woman. This whole removal of sanctions will inject this massive amount of money into this economy, and it will boom. An Iranian nuclear agreement, as this article says in The Diplomat, is a game changer. Now, God's engineering all this. Persia, of Ezekiel 38, is going to come into prominence. Now, here's just a simple example of the benefits of this. Now, this is what's known as the International North-South Transport Corridor. See, to get goods from India into Europe, you have to go around the blue line, and that blue line takes you miles out of your course. But now that Iran is opening up, I can now get stuff into Europe and Russia through this corridor. Now, this is precisely the corridor that was important in World War II. This was the corridor that Germany used. This was the corridor that the British used. And now the Indians, the Eastern Tarshish of Scripture, they're going to use that same corridor. So it's going to open up enormous amounts of beneficial trade, cheaper trade, all through sanctions being lifted. It's an amazing story of changes that are poised to happen in this area. Now, just because a deal has been reached between the West and Iran, don't think that Iran suddenly is going to become the friends of the West. This is 2 days after the deal was signed. Ayatollah Khamenei chastises an arrogant US. There's no conciliation here. The rhetoric against the West only continues. Its rhetoric against Israel only continues. Just because it's made this deal doesn't mean it's the friends of the West at all. Chastises an arrogant US. We've just signed a deal, shaken hands. You're arrogant, says Iran. And it will not stop regional conflict. Middle East rivals agree the Iran nuclear deal is no solution for regional turmoil. Iran and Saudi Arabia don't see eye to eye on many issues, but analysis of both countries agreed Tuesday on one thing: the nuclear deal has not cleared up enormous uncertainty about the future of the region or ended the threat of military strikes. The conflicts will continue. This deal that was made, there's only one winner out of this, and that's Iran, which will emerge as a huge power in that region. So here's a map of the proxy wars, the subtle shifts of national conflict that are being supported by these two countries. Iran and Iraq are at war with each other through their agents in Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan and Pakistan. Now Syria, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, that's the king of the North Territory. And Yemen is the Sheba of Scripture. So all of this is happening to realign the map, to make it closer to the Ezekiel 38 picture. The battle for Iraq is Saudi war on Iran. It's the powers behind the proxies that are significant. Why ISIS invasion of Iraq is really a war between Shiites and Sunnis for control of the Middle East. And that's what we've been seeing in our address this afternoon. The big players are behind the scenes of all of this. Proxy war in Yemen. Saudi Arabia and Iran vie for regional supremacy. So it's not just a little tin pot country having a little squabble. These are regional powers developing contests of who's going to flex the muscles the most in this region. Saudi Arabia and Iran vie for regional supremacy. So just recently, Saudi Arabia had had enough of Iran's meddling in Yemen. Yemen is the Sheba of Scripture. And so it cobbled together a coalition of forces to invade Yemen. They called it a decisive storm. And once again, the coalition of the Gulf states, Egypt, US, Tarshish, Dedan, together, trying to bring Sheba back into the fold, as it were. Now, once again, God is manipulating these alliances, and this decisive storm was an interesting invasion of Yemen, because it's the first time that Saudi Arabia has ever ventured beyond its borders with its own military personnel. So we are seeing things that have never happened before. Never happened before. The Telegraph says Operation Decisive Storm is an illustration of the powerful firepower the Saudis now have at their disposal to defend their interests. For the Yemen operation, King Salman ordered the deployment of 100 advanced fighter planes, 150,000 troops, numerous ground and sea assets, making it without question the most powerful combined military force assembled by any Arab country for decades. Now, these are things we have never witnessed before. Saudi Arabia stepping out of its country with an invasion force of 150,000 troops. Dedan and Sheba. If you thought the Syrian map was complex, the Yemeni map is equally complex. In green is a group called the Houthis. They're pro-Al-Qaeda. There in pink is Al-Qaeda, and in the bone colour are those who are pro-Saudi, those who are the Sunnis. Now, as you can see, a divided country. This was the spice region of the Bible. This was once a powerful dominion that supplied exotic spices at great profit to this region. Today, it's a desert country. internally racked by all of this enormous problem, but it's brought Saudi Arabia into that country to help it out. Iran, pushing the Al-Qaeda and the Houthis to try and defeat Saudi Arabia. Now the contest is in this region of Sheba. Well, just recently, and again there's ebbs and flows in the battle, the Saudi forces have actually taken Aden. And for the first time in a number of months, the front lines of Yemen's war shifts in favour of the Gulf states. And we would expect that. We would expect eventually that this whole crisis in Yemen will resolve itself into the alliance of Ezekiel 38. At the moment, it's in favour of the Gulf forces, and we expect to see that trend continue. But the consensus of Middle East opinion is that Iran is winning the war for dominance in the Middle East. Tehran and Riyadh are engaged in a naked struggle for power in the region. Individual rights and good governance be damned. It's not about good governance. It's not about people enjoying good government. It's a naked display of power, rivalry and aggression. And Iran is winning the war for that dominance. Iran's emerging empire, says the Washington Post. For the Saudis, now the Gulf Arabs, this is a nightmare. They're engaged in a titanic regional struggle with Iran, and they are losing Lebanon, losing Syria, watching post-US withdrawal Iraq come under increasing Iranian domination. They feel like they're under siege. The Persia of Ezekiel 38 is dominating, and they feel threatened by that. So much so that they have now asked America for 600 Patriot missiles, and America just recently said, we'll give you those missiles. So you see, the Iranian nuclear deal, instead of giving peace and security to the region, has only increased the liability of conflict, increased the instability, increased the weapons being poured into this country, as these two armed camps now stand off against each other. Even Israel responds. Israel knows that when sanctions are lifted and the money pours into Iran, Iran's going to use that money to prop up its proxy countries, and Hezbollah will benefit from that. And if Hezbollah will benefit from that, it means that they will buy more rockets against Israel. So Israel's now reacting by bringing its Iron Dome into the border there. And there's no way in the world that Iron Dome, sophisticated and incredible though it is, can knock out the sheer volume of rockets that will come across that border in time of warfare. The arsenal of Hezbollah is unbelievably large. But this is Israel's reaction, you see. People are knowing that once Iran gets the money, conflict will continue. Now what about Russia and Iran? Well, says the Business Insider, Russia and Iran just got even closer. All smiles, military agreements, everything's cozy. Vladimir Putin is staking out a big Russian payday in any Iran nuclear deal. In what many observers believe are the closing hours of the 2-year-long talks, well, we know they were finalised, one of Iran's final demands is the lifting of a UN embargo on the sale of conventional weapons, along with sanctions on Tehran's development of ballistic missiles. If this is the end game, then start counting Russian President Vladimir Putin among the winners. This cosy arrangement, you see, Russia built the nuclear infrastructure in Iran. It has a connection with Iran. And they're poised on the border, ready to do business with Iran. They're the big winners. Russia and Iran have increased trade relations, especially over the last 5 years, and they are involved in trade talks over nuclear technology, energy, arms sales, and have recently signed an intelligence agreement. This is the implications of this. The two countries are locked together. He's not going to Washington, he's going to Moscow. And so, the ink was just dry on the agreement between Washington and Tehran. The military embargo was removed, and now Iran has purchased the S-300 missile defence system, which this article says will shift the military balance. Why? The one thing Iran feared was an Israeli-Saudi strike against the nuclear facilities. Now the deal's been signed, they have the technology now to prevent that invasion happening. The first deal on the table, as the ink was drying, was to bring in the Russian technology to prevent that invasion ever happening. It feels secure. It feels safe. The coming Russian-Iran energy axis. Iran has the world's largest proven gas reserves as of 2014. The world's largest proven gas reserves. And sitting on the border are companies like Lukoil and Gazprom that want to do business with Iran. If they can lock in the energy, get its oil and gas, just like it was in World War II, then this becomes the basis of a strong regional relationship. It will happen. Russia wants to get into the deal first. Astounding, isn't it? What one deal has done in opening up Iran. So I'm going to conclude, brothers and sisters, with just one final quotation. You know, we've seen, I think, through this address, that the Persia of Ezekiel 38, Iran, has become a dominant power. And we're only just starting this dominance through this nuclear deal. It's allying itself with Russia, just as Ezekiel 38 said. It's violently anti-Israel, just as Ezekiel 38 said. It supports Hezbollah, just as Joel 3 said it would be anti-Semitic. It's forcing Dedan to defend Sheba. It's bringing Israel and Saudi Arabia together, the Dedan and Israel of the Scriptures. All of that is happening. Everything is on track, brothers and sisters. And these trends will continue to track until finally we have that mosaic picture of Ezekiel 38 absolutely in place. And there'll be world-dominant powers against Israel. But God has a future with Iran. It's an interesting prophecy in Jeremiah 49. And these last two verses of this prophecy are a latter-day prophecy. It's an interesting prophecy, really, because it deals with Persia and events in the Middle East in the time of Jeremiah. But the last couple of verses deal with the latter days. This is what it says. I will set my throne in Elam, says God. And I will destroy from thence the king and the princes, saith Yahweh. But it shall come to pass in the latter days that I will bring again the captivity of Elam, saith Yahweh. Now those two verses hold a wealth of information. We believe that God will establish the 12 apostles on the 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. But there's another throne. And this throne's in Elam. There's going to be thrones across the world. And who's going to sit on the throne of Elam? Well, we don't know. We're not told, are we? But interesting enough, one of the saints will occupy the throne of Elam. I will put my throne in Elam. Secondly, I will destroy, not just exile, not just remove, I will destroy from thence the king and the princes, the ayatollahs, the presidents, the Ahmadinejads of that whole society, destroyed. That anti-Semitism, that virulence of anti-Semitism will not only be removed, it will be absolutely extricated, excised from the country, destroyed. And you know those 5 million, 6 million Iranians in the diaspora? Those people who would love to be back home? God says, I'm going to reverse their captivity. Isn't that interesting that God has not only worked with the Jewish people in preserving that diaspora, but has also worked with an Iranian diaspora. And there they are, an identified group of people out there in the world, and God says, I'll bring you back. See, the current regime, the current people of Elam, the current people of Iran don't deserve to be part of God's kingdom. But those people who are dispersed across the world, those who have a less, should I say, aggressive and fanatic viewpoint, will be brought back to Elam and Persia to inhabit that place once more. Isn't that interesting that God has preserved that captivity and will bring it back to the region? Brothers and sisters, we can have absolute confidence that the plan of Ezekiel 38 is going to be fulfilled. And the events that we see around the world today are accelerating. The trends that we see are accelerating. The events that we are seeing means that God is firmly in control. We await the day when God will set his throne in Iran. Thank you.